There are gods who dwell in the light, who are worshipped in golden temples, whose names are spoken with reverence, and whose blessings are sought with upraised hands and grateful hearts. And then there are gods who belong to the darkness, whose names are whispered rather than proclaimed, who are approached not with hope but with fear, not with love but with respect for their terrible power. Gods who do not promise salvation or comfort or peace, but who offer something far more primal and far more necessary, the truth of what we are, the acceptance of what we must become, and the understanding that life and death are not opposites, but partners in an endless dance. The Morrigan is such a goddess. She is not the kind of deity who tends gardens or blesses marriages or ensures that crops grow tall and golden in the fields. She is the goddess of the battlefield, of the moment when steel meets flesh, when breath becomes death, when fate itself is decided in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She is the shadow that falls across the warrior before the killing blow. She is the crow that circles above the dying. She is the voice that whispers prophecy in the darkness, telling not what we wish to hear, but what we need to know, whether we can bear it or not. In the ancient myths of Ireland, in the stories told by firelight, when the wind howled outside and the darkness pressed close, the Morrigan was not a single goddess but three, or perhaps one goddess with three faces, three aspects, three terrible and beautiful manifestations. She was called by many names, and each name was a key that unlocked a different door into the dark mystery of her nature. Badb, the battle crow, who flew shrieking over warriors and whose cry foretold death. Macha, the sovereignty of the land itself, fierce and proud and demanding. And Nemain, whose name means frenzy or panic, who drove men mad with terror, who could shatter an army's courage with a single scream. But all of these were the Morrigan, and the Morrigan was all of these. She was the triple goddess, the threefold death, the phantom queen who stood at the crossroads where past, present, and future converge, where the thread of life meets the blade that cuts it short. She did not cause death, the story said, but she witnessed it, she proclaimed it, she wove it into the great pattern of fate that no mortal and no god could escape. Tonight, we journey into her realm, into the blood-soaked fields and the mist-shrouded battlegrounds where she holds dominion. We will meet her in her many forms. We'll hear the beating of her raven wings. We'll listen to her prophecies and her laughter, her promises and her threats. We will learn why warriors both feared and honored her, why kings sought her favor even as they trembled at her approach, and why she remains, even now, one of the most powerful and most enigmatic figures in all of Celtic mythology. This is the story of the Morrigan, goddess of fate, of war, and of the shadows that lie between what is and what must be. Our journey into darkness begins now.
Before we can understand the Morrigan, we must understand the world that created her, the culture that needed her, the people for whom she was not a metaphor or a symbol, but a living reality. Ancient Celtic Ireland was a warrior culture, a society built on courage, on honor, on the understanding that a person's worth was measured by their deeds in battle and their willingness to face death without flinching. This was not because the Celts were particularly violent or bloodthirsty, but because violence was a fact of life, an ever-present reality in a world of competing tribes, limited resources, and the constant threat of invasion or internal conflict. In such a world, war was not an aberration, but a constant. It was the way disputes were settled, the way power was claimed and maintained, the way young men proved their worth and earned their place in the community. And so the culture developed an elaborate mythology around warfare, a complex set of beliefs and rituals that transformed the chaos and horror of battle into something meaningful, something sacred, something that could be endured and even embraced. The Morrigan was the heart of that mythology. She was the divine presence on the battlefield, the supernatural force that turned mere combat into cosmic drama. When warriors went to war, they believed they were not just fighting for land or cattle or prestige. They were participating in a sacred act, a ritual that had been ordained by the gods, a pattern that had been woven into the fabric of fate itself. And the Morrigan was the weaver, the one who held the threads, the one who decided which threads would be cut and which would continue into the future. But she was not a distant, abstract force. She was immediate, personal, terrifyingly present. Warriors reported seeing her before battles, appearing in various forms, sometimes as a beautiful woman washing bloody armor in a river, sometimes as an old crone who prophesied doom, sometimes as a crow or raven that landed on a warrior's shoulder or circled above his head. To see her was to know that death was near, that fate had been sealed, that the thread was about to be cut. Yet even in this role as herald of death, she was not entirely malevolent. She was honest. She told the truth. She did not deceive or offer false hope. And for the Celtic warriors who valued courage above all else, who believed that it was better to face death with open eyes than to be taken by surprise, this honesty was itself a kind of gift. The Morrigan gave warriors the opportunity to meet their fate with dignity, to die well rather than to die unknowing. The most famous story of the Morrigan, the tale that defines her character and her power more than any other, is her appearance in the epic saga known as the Tan Bo Cualinge, the cattle raid of Cooley. This is one of the great masterworks of Irish mythology, a sprawling, violent, tragic story of war and honor and the terrible price of heroism. And at its center, in a series of encounters that are by turns seductive, threatening, prophetic, and deeply strange, is the relationship between the Morrigan and the greatest of all Irish heroes, Cú Chulainn.
Cú Chulainn was not just a warrior. He was the warrior, the living embodiment of everything the Celtic culture valued. He was young, beautiful, impossibly brave, skilled beyond measure, and touched by a kind of divine madness that made him both more and less than human when the battle fury was upon him. He was also doomed, marked from birth by prophecies that promised him glory and early death in equal measure. He would be famous, the stories said, remembered for all time, but he would die young, cut down in his prime, his life a brilliant flame that would burn out long before its time. The Morrigan knew this. She knew his fate because she was fate, because she was the one who wove the pattern, who held the thread, who stood at the crossroads and pointed the way. And so she came to him, not once, but many times, in many forms, testing him, challenging him, offering him gifts he was too proud to accept, and warnings he was too stubborn to heed. Their first meeting is one of the strangest and most unsettling passages in all of Celtic mythology. Cú Chulainn was at a ford, a liminal place, a threshold between one territory and another, and he was engaged in single combat with a warrior from the opposing army. This was how war was conducted in the heroic age, not as mass slaughter, but as a series of individual duels, each one a test of skill and courage and honor. And Cú Chulainn, as always, was winning. Then a young woman appeared. She was beautiful, dressed in fine clothes, riding in a chariot drawn by a red horse. She approached Cú Chulainn and told him that she had fallen in love with him, that she had been watching him, that she wanted to be with him,
to support him, to give him her power and her protection. She was, though she did not say it directly, offering herself to him, offering an alliance that would have been immensely valuable, for she was no ordinary woman, but a goddess, and her favor could mean the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death. But Cú Chulainn, in his pride and his focus on the battle at hand, rejected her. He told her, bluntly, cruelly, that he had no time for women, that he was too busy with the business of war to be distracted by love or desire. He did not recognize who she was, or perhaps he did and did not care. He turned away from her, dismissing her as if she were nothing. The young woman's demeanor changed in an instant. The beautiful maiden vanished, and in her place stood something else, something darker and more terrible. She revealed herself as the Morrigan, and she told Cú Chulainn exactly what his rejection had cost him. "I will come against you," she said, "when you are in combat, and I will be your hindrance." She would not fight him directly, for that was not her way, but she would appear on the battlefield in various forms, would disrupt his combat, would attack him at his most vulnerable moments, and through her interference she would ensure that he was wounded, weakened, brought closer to the death that was already waiting for him.
And she kept her promise. In his next battle, as Cú Chulainn fought at the ford, defending Ulster single-handedly against the armies of Queen Badb, the Morrigan came to him in 3 forms, one after another, each one designed to destabilize him, to break his concentration, to create the opening through which death could enter. First, she came as an eel, slithering through the water of the ford, wrapping around his legs, trying to trip him, to drag him down, to make him vulnerable to his opponent's weapons. Cú Chulainn, even in the midst of combat, recognized the supernatural attack. He struck down at the eel with such force that he broke its ribs, driving it away, but not destroying it. Then she came as a wolf, a gray she-wolf that stampeded a herd of cattle toward him, trying to overwhelm him, to create chaos, to force him to divide his attention between his human opponent and the charging animals. Again Cú Chulainn fought back, striking the wolf with a sling stone that took out one of its eyes, sending it fleeing, wounded but not defeated. Finally, she came as a heifer, a white cow with red ears, the colors of the other world, leading another stampede, another attempt to break his defense. And once more Cú Chulainn struck, breaking the heifer's leg, forcing it to retreat. 3 times she attacked, and 3 times he wounded her. But she had accomplished her purpose. He was tired now, distracted, his defenses weakened, and though he continued to fight, though he continued to win his individual combats at the ford, he was closer to his death than he had been before. The Morrigan had not killed him, but she had pushed him further down the path that would end in his destruction. But the story does not end there, for the Morrigan was not simply cruel, not merely vengeful. She was complex, as befitted a goddess of fate, a being who understood that death and life were not enemies, but parts of the same whole. After the battle, Cú Chulainn encountered an old woman milking a cow. She had 3 wounds, and as she milked, she offered him 3 drinks of milk. He accepted, and with each drink, he blessed her, wishing her health and healing. And with each blessing, one of her wounds healed. For he did not know that the old woman was the Morrigan herself, now in the guise of a crone, and that the wounds she bore were the ones he had inflicted when she had attacked him as eel, wolf, and heifer. By healing her, by offering kindness to what he thought was simply an old woman in need, he inadvertently lifted the curse he had brought upon himself through his earlier rejection. The Morrigan, in turn, did not attack him again. She had tested him and found him wanting in wisdom, but she had also found something else, a man who, despite his pride and his stubbornness, was capable of compassion, capable of recognizing the humanity in others, even when he did not recognize the divine.
This is the essential paradox of the Morrigan's relationship with Cú Chulainn. She loved him in her way. She had offered herself to him, had wanted to be his ally, his protector, his companion. But when he rejected her, she became his enemy, not out of spite, but because that was her nature, that was her role. She was fate, and fate cannot be denied or dismissed without consequence. Yet even as his enemy, she was not entirely hostile. She tested him, taught him, pushed him toward the understanding he would need to face his own death with courage and dignity. The final meeting between the Morrigan and Cú Chulainn comes at the very end of his life, in the moments before his death. By this point in the saga, Cú Chulainn knows his time has come. The prophecies that have haunted him since childhood are finally coming true. He has been cursed, tricked into breaking his gyasa, the sacred taboos that protected him, and he knows that he is going to die. But he is determined to die as he lived, standing, fighting, refusing to yield even to fate itself. He goes to the battlefield one last time, already wounded, already weakening. He knows he cannot win, but he will not surrender. And as he fights, the Morrigan appears. This time she does not attack. She does not interfere. She simply watches. She perches on his shoulder in the form of a crow, a raven, the death bird, her presence a confirmation of what Cú Chulainn already knows. His thread has been cut. His fate is sealed. His story is ending. And when he can no longer stand, when his strength finally fails, Cú Chulainn does something extraordinary. He ties himself to a standing stone with his own belt, determined to die on his feet, determined that even in death his enemies will see him standing, defiant, unbroken. And there, bound to the stone, he dies. And only when he is truly dead, when his spirit has left his body, does the Morrigan move. She flies down from his shoulder and lands on the stone beside him, and her presence, her landing, is the signal to his enemies that it is finally safe to approach, that the great hero is truly gone. This image, the Morrigan perched beside the dead hero, is one of the most powerful and most haunting in all of Celtic mythology. It is an image of death, certainly, but it is also an image of honor, of respect, of a strange kind of love. The Morrigan did not abandon Cú Chulainn. She was with him at the end, as she had been with him throughout his life. She witnessed his death, as she witnessed all deaths, and in witnessing, she gave it meaning, gave it dignity, gave it a place in the great pattern of fate. But the Morrigan was not only concerned with individual warriors, no matter how great. She was also a goddess of sovereignty, of the land itself, and her role in the mythology extended far beyond the battlefield, into the realm of kingship, of political power, of the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. In Celtic belief, the land was not a possession, but a living entity, a goddess in her own right, who granted sovereignty to the king who proved himself worthy and who could withdraw that sovereignty, bringing ruin and disaster if the king failed in his duties.
The Morrigan was intimately connected with this concept of sovereignty. In many stories, she appears to kings and would-be kings, testing them, challenging them, offering them her favor if they prove themselves worthy. Sometimes she appears as a beautiful woman who offers herself in marriage, and the king who accepts her offer gains the right to rule. Sometimes she appears as a hideous crone who demands to be treated with respect and kindness, and the king who shows compassion despite her appearance is rewarded with transformation, the crone becoming beautiful again and granting him the sovereignty he seeks. But she was also the goddess who could withdraw sovereignty, who could curse a king who broke the sacred laws, who failed to uphold justice, who ruled through tyranny rather than through strength and wisdom. Her curse could bring famine to the land, defeat in battle, internal strife, and ultimately the king's downfall and death. She was, in this aspect, not just the goddess of war, but the goddess of the social and cosmic order, the one who ensured that power was used rightly, that kings remembered they ruled not by their own authority, but by the grace of the goddess and the consent of the land itself. There is a story told of the Morrigan and the great King Conaire Mór, a tale that illustrates her role as both granter and withdrawer of sovereignty. Conaire was a good king, wise and just, and his reign brought prosperity to Ireland. But he was bound by many geasa, sacred prohibitions that he had to observe to maintain his power and his life. And through a series of unfortunate events, through bad luck, and perhaps through the machinations of fate itself, Conaire broke his geasa, one by one, until finally all the protections were gone and he was vulnerable. The Morrigan appeared to him in various forms throughout this process, warning him, showing him the path he was on, giving him opportunities to turn back. But Conaire, like so many heroes, was caught in the current of his own story, unable to see the doom that was approaching until it was too late. And when the final battle came, when he made his last stand in a burning building surrounded by enemies, the Morrigan was there, not as his protector, but as his witness, watching as the sovereignty she had granted was taken away, watching as the king who had broken the sacred laws paid the ultimate price. The Morrigan's association with crows and ravens is one of her most distinctive and most powerful attributes. These birds, with their black feathers and their harsh cries, with their habit of gathering on battlefields to feed on the corpses of the fallen, were perfect symbols for a goddess of death and fate. But in Celtic belief, they were more than symbols. They were her literal form, the shape she took when she walked in the world, the body she inhabited when she needed to move among mortals. To see a crow or raven on the battlefield was to know that the Morrigan was present, that she was watching, that she was making her judgments about who would live and who would die. Warriors reported seeing flocks of ravens before battles, circling overhead, their cries interpreted as prophecies, as warnings, as pronouncements of doom. And after the battle, the ravens descended to feed, and in this act, they were not just scavenging birds, but the goddess herself, taking her due, claiming the dead as her own, ensuring that the cycle of death and rebirth continued.
But the Morrigan's raven form was not only about death. Ravens are also birds of intelligence, of cunning, of memory. They are problem solvers, communicators, creatures of remarkable complexity. In choosing this form, the Morrigan revealed something essential about her nature. She was not a mindless force of destruction. She was a being of deep wisdom, of terrible knowledge, of an understanding of the patterns of fate that transcended mortal comprehension. When she appeared as a raven, she brought not just death, but insight, not just endings, but the wisdom that comes from accepting that all things must end. There is a tradition in Irish folklore, one that persisted long after the conversion to Christianity, that certain individuals had the ability to shapeshift, to take on animal forms, particularly the forms of birds. These individuals were often associated with the Morrigan, seen as her servants or her chosen ones, people who had been touched by her power and who could move between the human world and the animal world, between the ordinary and the supernatural. To encounter such a person, to meet a raven that watched you with two intelligent eyes, was to have a brush with the divine, with the ancient power that had never really left the land, that waited in the shadows and the mists for those who still knew how to see. The Morrigan's role as a prophet, as a seer who could look into the future and declare what was to come, is another essential aspect of her nature. She did not cause the future to unfold in a particular way, at least not directly. Rather, she could see the pattern, could read the threads of fate, could understand where the current of events was leading. And she spoke this knowledge, sometimes to help, sometimes to warn, sometimes simply because the truth demanded to be told, regardless of whether anyone wanted to hear it. Her prophecies were not gentle or comforting. They were stark, brutal, uncompromising declarations of what was to come. When she prophesied death, death came. When she declared that a battle would be lost, it was lost. When she pronounced doom upon a person or a kingdom, that doom was inevitable. This made her terrifying, for who wants to hear such prophecies? Who wants to know the day and the manner of their death? But it also made her valuable. For those who were brave enough to listen, who were wise enough to accept her words, could at least prepare themselves, could face their fate with courage rather than being taken by surprise. There is a famous prophecy attributed to the Morrigan, one that speaks not of individual deaths, but of the end of an entire world, of the collapse of civilization itself. It appears in a text known as Cuf Mage Tured, the Second Battle of Mage Tured, one of the central mythological texts of Ireland. After the great battle is won, after the Tuatha De Danann have defeated the Fomorians and secured their rule over Ireland, the Morrigan delivers a prophecy that is both victory song and lament, both celebration and warning. She proclaims the peace that will follow the battle, the prosperity that will come to the land. But then her tone shifts, darkens, and she begins to describe a future age when the old order will collapse, when the sacred bonds will be broken, when honor will be forgotten and chaos will reign. She speaks of a time when summers will be without flowers, cows will be without milk, women without modesty, men without valor, conquests without a king. It is a vision of apocalypse, of the end of the world as the Celts knew it, a time when all the values that held society together will have been abandoned and only darkness will remain.
This prophecy, dark and terrible as it is, reveals something profound about the Morrigan's role in the mythology. She was not just a goddess of the present moment, of the individual battle or the individual death. She was a goddess of time itself, of the great cycles of rise and fall, of creation and destruction, of the understanding that all things, even gods, even worlds, must eventually come to an end. Her vision extended beyond the immediate, beyond the personal, to encompass the fate of entire civilizations, the destiny of the land itself. The Morrigan's sexuality is another aspect of her character that deserves attention, for it is complex, powerful, and often misunderstood. When she appeared to Cú Chulainn as a beautiful young woman offering herself to him, she was not simply trying to seduce him in the ordinary sense. She was offering him an alliance, a sacred marriage, a union that would have bound him to her power and her protection. In Celtic belief, the sexual union between a warrior or king and a goddess of sovereignty was not just a personal relationship, but a political and cosmic act, one that granted legitimacy, power, and the favor of the land itself. By rejecting her, Cú Chulainn was not just spurning a potential lover. He was refusing a sacred gift, breaking a cosmic protocol, insulting the divine. And the consequences were severe, as they had to be. For the gods do not offer their favor lightly, and to reject such an offer was to invite the opposite, to ensure that what could have been blessing would become curse.
But the Morrigan's sexuality was not always about offering favor. Sometimes it was about power, domination, the assertion of her will. In some stories, she appears to men not to offer them a choice, but to demand their submission, to test whether they have the courage to face a goddess on her own terms. And in these encounters, the men who fail the test, who are too weak or too cowardly or too foolish, do not just lose the goddess's favor. They lose their lives, their honor, their place in the world. This aspect of the Morrigan makes her uncomfortable for modern sensibilities, for she does not fit neatly into categories of good or evil, empowerment or oppression. She is a goddess who takes what she wants, who demands respect and obedience, who punishes those who fail her tests. But she is also a goddess who offers genuine power to those who prove themselves worthy, who gives her favor freely to those who show courage and wisdom. She is, in short, a goddess who operates on her own terms, according to her own rules, and who demands that those who interact with her rise to meet her on her own level, rather than expecting her to accommodate their weaknesses. As Christianity spread across Ireland in the early medieval period, the old gods did not simply disappear. They went underground, transformed, adapted, found new forms and new names. The Morrigan, like many of the Tua de Dinan, was too powerful, too deeply embedded in the landscape and the culture to simply be erased. And so she persisted, but in changed forms, in ways that allowed her to exist alongside the new faith rather than in direct opposition to it.
In some places, she was demonized, turned into a witch or a malevolent fairy, a being of pure evil who served the Christian devil rather than standing as a divine power in her own right. In other places, she was sanitized, softened, turned into a romanticized figure of folklore, a fairy queen, or a mysterious woman of the hills whose darker aspects were downplayed or forgotten. And in still other places she was simply forgotten, her name lost, her stories no longer told, surviving only as a vague sense of something ancient and powerful that still haunted certain landscapes, certain battlefields, certain crossroads. But she was never entirely gone. In Irish folklore collected in the 19th and 20th centuries, there are still traces of her. Old people in rural areas would tell stories of the washers at the ford, spectral women seen washing bloody clothes in rivers before battles, a clear echo of the Morrigan's ancient role as prophet of death. They would tell of the Bean Sia, the banshee, whose cry foretold death, another echo of Badb, the battle crow, whose shriek was the last sound many warriors heard. They would tell of fairy women who appeared to men and offered them power or love or knowledge, tests that echoed the ancient encounters between gods and mortals. And in more recent times, as neo-paganism has grown and as people have sought to reconnect with the pre-Christian spiritualities of Europe, the Morrigan has experienced a remarkable revival. Modern practitioners of Celtic paganism honor her as a goddess of personal power, of transformation, of the courage to face death and darkness without flinching. They see in her not a relic of a violent past, but a model for living with integrity in a world that still demands courage, that still requires us to face uncomfortable truths, that still calls us to accept our mortality and to live with the knowledge that all things, even ourselves, must eventually end. This modern Morrigan is not always the same as the ancient one. She has been reinterpreted, reshaped, given new meanings and new significance. But the core remains. She is still the goddess who stands at the crossroads, who witnesses death, who tells uncomfortable truths, who demands courage and wisdom from those who would honor her. She is still the shadow that falls across the path, the crow that circles overhead, the voice that whispers in the darkness, reminding us that we are mortal, that our time is limited, and that we must choose, in the time we have, what kind of story we will tell with our lives. As we reach the end of our journey through the mythology and the mystery of the Morrigan, we are left with a figure who defies easy categorization, who resists any attempt to reduce her to a simple symbol
or a comfortable lesson. She is a goddess of contradictions, of darkness and wisdom, of love and war, of fate and freedom. She is beautiful and terrible, generous and cruel, honest and enigmatic. She is, in short, a deity who reflects the complexity of existence itself, who embodies the understanding that life is not a simple story with clear heroes and villains, but a complex pattern of choices and consequences, of courage and cowardice, of fate accepted and fate resisted. The Celtic warriors who honored her understood something that our modern world often forgets, that death is not the enemy, but the constant companion, that to live well requires us to accept our mortality rather than to deny it, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act rightly despite fear. The Morrigan taught these lessons not through gentle parables or comforting platitudes, but through harsh experience, through prophecy and battle, through the raw encounter with mortality that strips away all illusions and leaves only the essential truth.
And what is that truth? Perhaps it is this, that we are all standing at the ford, fighting our own battles, facing our own fates. That we will all eventually meet the Morrigan in one form or another, will hear the beating of raven wings, will feel the presence of something ancient and powerful that has come to witness our end. And when that moment comes, we will have to choose how we face it. Will we face it with courage, tied to our own standing stone, refusing to yield even to the inevitable? Will we face it with wisdom, having learned the lessons that the goddess has been trying to teach us throughout our lives? Will we face it with grace, accepting that death is not a failure but a completion, not an ending but a transformation? The Morrigan does not promise us immortality. She does not promise us victory. She does not even promise us that our deaths will be meaningful or that our lives will be remembered. What she promises is only this, that if we live with courage, if we face the truth without flinching, if we honor the sacred obligations that bind us to the land and to each other, and to the great pattern of fate, then we will die well. And in the Celtic world, in the world that created the Morrigan and that she in turn helped to create, that was enough. That was everything. The shadows lengthen, and the crows gather, and the voice in the darkness speaks its prophecy. The Morrigan waits, as she has always waited, at the crossroads, at the ford, at the threshold between what is and what must be. She is watching, she is witnessing, she is weaving the pattern. And someday, when our own thread is cut, when our own story ends, we will meet her there, in that liminal space, in that moment of transformation. And she will ask us, without words, the only question that matters. Did we live well? Did we face our fate with courage? Did we honor the truth? The answer, when it comes, will be our own. But the Morrigan will be there to hear it, to witness it, to weave it into the great pattern. For she is fate, she is war, she is the shadow, and she is eternal.